Good day, everyone, and welcome back to our Social Science Festival, 2020 COVID edition this year. I'm in the auditorium, obviously at the college where I would have loved to be with the rest of you. But unfortunately, as you all know, circumstances don't permit this year. So we've decided to use Zoom webinar as a technological platform to have our festival this year. So before I introduce our presenter this morning, I just wanted to give everyone a little rundown about how this is going to function. Basically, I will introduce the presenter in a few seconds. Today's presenter gave us a pre-recorded presentation. So it's going to be a streaming video that you're going to see through my share screen function. However, he is with us, today's presenter, Charbel Mourad. He is going to take in the presentation, his own presentation with us, and be available right after for a live Q&A. So think of questions, folks, as you're listening to this, jot them down. The way the Q&A will work, once the video has finished, there's going to be a Q&A board. You have a Q&A function or question or answer function in Zoom webinar. You can't activate cameras or mics, unfortunately. So what you'd have to do is you're going to have to ask your questions in written form, right? Type them out and I'll see them here. I will read them out to Charbel, and Charbel will be able to answer them. So let's get started. Charbel's joined us on the camera. It's a treat for me, everyone, to announce to you the presenter for this morning. Charbel Mourad is a personal friend. Charbel and I did undergraduate and graduate studies together, and since then we've had a personal friendship that we've kept going to this day, and so it's a real treat to have him, and I was glad that he accepted the invitation and the opportunity to present. Now, Charbel's done a whole lot since we first met. He's worked for the Canadian federal government for a number of years, but, and eventually his trajectory has brought him to the English Montreal School Board. And from there, to proceed and various other things that he's doing right now in his current functions. So he brings a wealth of interesting experiences, knowledge, and information to share with us this morning in his presentation. So that's a little bit about Charbel, and we'll come back to him live, so I'm gonna start the video here. If you can give me a few seconds, everybody, let me get this share screen function going.
Good morning, my name is Charbel, and it's a pleasure to be with you today at the Vanier Social Science Talks. I'm going to be spending about 30 minutes, a little bit over 30 minutes this morning, speaking to you about the English community in Quebec's educational system, more specifically. And at that point, I'll turn the floor over to you, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me, and it'll be my pleasure to try and answer them as best as I can. So, social science is the scientific study of human society and social relationships. In other words, how do we interact with each other, with one another in society? And community, of course, is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. It's important that I point out up front that when we speak about community, there's a really important backdrop. As we all know, we're going through difficult times, I think it's fair to say, from the climate crisis, for example, wild fires, forest fires in California, to the social and political unrest in the United States of America that is manifest through different movements such as Black Lives Matter, to, of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic that has really changed the way that we live, the way we interact with one another, and even the way that we work. And a testament to that is the fact that today we're together online and not in person. So for me, community is the remedy to a lot of these difficulties and challenges to the extent that community is like the cohesive glue that brings us back together. For those of you that are fortunate enough to be part of a community, you can attest to the fact that there's a lot of advantages that we can pull from being part of a larger group, being part of a larger network. And so it's my pleasure to be speaking to you about the English community today, and to look at ways to strengthen this important community in Quebec. So I wanted to just take a moment, I'm sharing my screen here, to play a video for you from Barack Obama, telling us what he feels is important in community in today's day and age. So here you go.
Hey everybody. Michelle and I, obviously, like everybody across the country, are sobered by the extraordinary challenges that this pandemic brings. But the aftermath of this is going to be significant. And if there was ever a time in which community mobilization, organization, social networks, trust building, mutual support, and aid were necessary, now is the time. And, the whole point of me and Michelle forming the Obama Foundation and then looking to build the Obama Presidential Center on the South Side was to foster those kinds of values and to promote that kind of unity and sense of common purpose and concrete activity that could promote opportunity and build businesses and pathways for action that improves people's lives, because I've always believed that government is critical, but it is not enough, and that change comes from the bottom up.
They've been calling Chicago the most segregated city in the country.
So for Barack Obama, and of course for many people, as I said earlier, community is really important. It's the network from which we can derive a lot of positive. And when we talk about community in Quebec, and in terms of numbers, the English community in Quebec represents 13.7% of Quebec's population. When we break that down into actual numbers, we're looking at about 1,103,475 people. So before I go any further, some of you might be wondering, who am I, and why is this important to me? And I just wanted to spend a minute here and say, as I said at the beginning, my name is Charbel Mourad, and I'm born in Lebanon. I'm born in Lebanon in 1976 during the Civil War. And we fled Lebanon, and I grew up in the United States of America, where I studied English in elementary school. We then immigrated to Quebec in 1987, and once we came to Quebec, because of the Charter of French Language, I was required to go to French high school. When I was given the choice, I opted to go to Vanier College, so it's my pleasure to be back speaking to some students from Vanier College. I then went on to Concordia University, where I got a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in public policy. And today I'm fortunate enough to be working with the 9 English school boards as their director of corporate training. So while I didn't study at a public school board growing up in Quebec, I am fortunate enough to be working with the school boards. My wife did study in English in Quebec, and so do my 2 kids at the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board. So when I was asked to give a talk, I agreed, and it's my pleasure to try and give back in any way that I can to a community that has served me and continues to serve me and my family really well. So where do we study here in Quebec for those of us that want to study in English? We have some options. We have some really good options. We can go to 9 school boards, 23 private schools, 11 colleges, or 3 universities. In terms of school boards, there are the Central Quebec School Board, the Eastern Township School Board, Eastern Shore School Board, English Montreal, Lester B. Pearson, New Frontiers, Riverside School Board, Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board, and the Western Quebec School Board. So as you can see from the names, the school boards cover the whole province of Quebec, which is great because anyone living in any region in Quebec does have the option to go to an English school within one of those school boards. There are 23 private schools as part of the Quebec Association for Independent Schools. And for any of you that are interested in learning more about private schools, you can do so by going on to the QAIS website, where they provide more information. In terms of colleges, there are 5 public CEGEPs: Champlain College, Dawson, John Abbott, Heritage, and of course Vanier College. In terms of private colleges, there's AV, Centennial, Collège Universel, and Marianopolis College. And then there's a third category, which are again public CEGEPs, but that have a bilingual status. And here we're talking about Cégep de la Gaspésie and Cégep des Sept-Îles. For those of us pursuing our education and going into university, there are 3 choices. On the island of Montreal, we have Concordia University and McGill University. And off island, there is Bishop's University as well. So those are some places where we can study. Where do we live? In Quebec, we live, of course, in all regions of Quebec. However, the top 3 regions most populated by the English-speaking community are Montreal, Montérégie, and Laval in that order. So in Montreal, we have 56.7% of the English community. In the Montérégie region, we have 15.5%. And in the region of Laval, we have 8.2% of the community that live in Laval. So what are our rights and what are the rules by which we must abide being English, living in Quebec, and studying in Quebec? In other words, how do those rights and obligations intersect? Well, there are really 3 pillars, 3 legislative frameworks that guide what we do and how we study in Quebec. And those legislative frameworks are the Education Act, the Charter of the French Language, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When we speak of the Education Act, it's an act that was put in place back in the 60s, and it's the act that governs all matters pertaining to education in Quebec. So whether we're looking at a student's rights to free education up until the age of 18, or the government's responsibility to establish French school service centers and school boards, it's all governed by and found within the Education Act. The Charter of the French Language stipulates that French is the distinctive language of the people of Quebec, that it's in the majority, that it's also the instrument by which people have articulated their identity, and is therefore considered to be the official language of Quebec. There are, however, stipulations within the Charter of the French Language that give rights to Anglophones that want to study in Quebec. For instance, the following children, at the request of their parents, as per Section 73 of the Charter of the French Language, can receive instruction in English. Those that have received elementary instruction in English in Canada, those parents that have received it, can pass that right along to their children. And also, the children that have received instruction in English as per Section 1 of Section 73 can pass the right along to their brothers and sisters. In other words, if I study in English in Quebec, I can pass that right along to my brother and sister. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes the equality of both official languages and the principle of advancing the equality of status or use of English and French as the official languages of Canada. Now, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like the Charter of the French Language, protects minority language educational rights by allowing children to study in their language of choice if, again, two criteria are met, which essentially are whose first language learned and still understood is that of English, or who have received their primary school instruction in Canada in English. And those are two stipulations as per Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that are sort of parallel to the Canadian, to my apologies, to the Charter of the French language. Now, in my case, just to share a personal example, I grew up in the US and studied in English. So when I came to Quebec in 1987, I was not able to, as per one of these sections, access English language education because I studied in English, but I did so outside of Canada. And my parents studied in Lebanon. So I couldn't use that section to access English education. Now, there are some other exceptions I want to speak to you about. For example, if a student has learning difficulties, they could, even though these sections don't apply, request to study in English. Sometimes those requests are approved, sometimes they're rejected, but it is a possibility. And one last exception I'd like to speak to you about is having the exception to study in English based on humanitarian rights. And here again, I'll share a personal story. When we came to Canada, we're 5 siblings, and my oldest sister came to Canada and she was entering grade 11, so secondary 5. And based on humanitarian grounds, the government of Quebec allowed my sister to study in English. Okay, of course they did that, on the premise that if she were to go into grade 11 in French, she probably would not be successful, not having learned French previously. And so in order to ensure success in high school, they allowed, on humanitarian grounds, they allowed her to pursue her education in English. So we have those legislative frameworks, and certainly in some cases they sound restrictive. And so, of course, some of you might be wondering, and this is a question I often ask myself, how is the English community doing? Is the English community strong in Quebec? And here I bring your attention to a Canadian Heritage report that argues that, in fact, yes, the English community is vibrant in Quebec, and that's great to hear. For example, the English community is seeing a rise in numbers, a rise in demographics. Also, increased bilingualism within the English community in Quebec. The English community is also seen as highly educated. Their sense of belonging, however, moves away from Quebec towards Canada, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. On the downside, the English community is said to have, and it's shown to have, lower income levels compared to their French counterparts. And of course, we experience the phenomenon of the brain drain outside of Quebec towards the rest of Canada. So on demographics, the total Anglophone population in Quebec as of 2006 rose to 995,000, which is equal to 13.4% of all Quebecers. And we know, based on the numbers I gave at the outset, that number is now past a million plus individuals that consider themselves Anglophone within Quebec. And it's important here to point out that the way that's possible, because when we look at, for example, the Charter of the French language, of course, it's safe to assume, and we see the numbers bear out, that registrations in the English school boards have gone down over the years, yet somehow the population continues to rise. And that's explained by, for example, the fact that a lot of the newly arrived immigrants choose English as their language of choice. So that is helping our numbers overall. On bilingualism, the English-French bilingualism among English speakers has increased significantly over the years. For example, from 1971 to 2006, the numbers have gone up from 37% being bilingual to now 69.8% being bilingual, which is, of course, much higher than the 36.1% bilingualism among Francophones. This is, of course, in 2006 here in Quebec. On education, the English-speaking communities overall are at the upper end of the educational spectrum compared to the French-speaking majority, with almost 25% having a university degree or diploma. compared to slightly more than 15% of the French-speaking community. And here this is important. This basically means that as Anglophones, we are encouraging our children, young adults, to pursue their education, getting into the university levels, which is, of course, a good thing and has a positive impact on our income levels. However, here it's important to mention that when other options are considered, for example, vocational education as an alternate path to university, the choice is not made as frequently within the English community, and I'll explain that in a couple of moments, and the negative impacts that may have on our abilities to obtain high-paying jobs in Quebec. In terms of our sense of belonging, as I mentioned, the Anglophones in Quebec have a greater sense of belonging to Canada as opposed to Quebec. In fact, they show a higher attachment to Canada than the French-speaking Quebecers, 93.6% versus 71.2% among Francophones. But they also have the lowest sense of belonging to their province at 69.7%. And obviously that could be problematic because it's important that we participate in our local communities, that we participate in the province within which we live and work, which is Quebec. And I'm going to propose some ideas on how we can increase that sense of belonging. Regarding income levels, today more English than French speakers live below the low income threshold at 22% versus 16%. And those living outside major urban areas have higher rates of underemployment and poverty. In other words, studies show that those living out of the islands of Montreal and Laval and Montérégie, for example, have lower income levels than those living within those regions. But overall, the income levels of the Anglophone community are lower than our French counterparts. It goes without saying that's problematic. We got to continuously work on ways to improve our income levels within Quebec. There's a phenomenon that the English-speaking community also experience, and it's the phenomenon of the brain drain. Here, based on mobility patterns from 1996 to 2001, the analysis shows that more than 8,000 English speakers have migrated to other provinces in Canada. So those are 8,000 English speakers, obviously, that bring down our numbers in terms of demographics. So that's problematic in and of itself. But on top of that, those that are leaving are those that have post-secondary degrees. 60% of the 8,000 had post-secondary degrees, and 69% of that group were reported to be bilingual. So what that means is not only do we have 8,000 individuals leaving Quebec, but we specifically have 8,000 individuals that we would obviously rather retain here in Quebec. We want to retain all English-speaking individuals. However, those that have those bachelor's degrees and are bilingual are also those that are helping bring up our numbers in terms of our income levels, in terms of our bilingualism. So we're hoping to try and retain most of the 8,000 here in Quebec. That retention will have positive impacts on other areas of our community in the province. So obviously I've pointed out some challenges, and I'm going to go through them one by one, but I'm also going to propose some solutions. They're ideas meant to start a conversation that hopefully can resonate with you, and maybe these are ideas you can take into your circles, and you can influence those that are around decision-making tables to maybe begin thinking about these solutions and implementing them. I will also say some of them are already being implemented, but as we see from the numbers, our work is not done here. We have to, as a minority group, continue to focus on how we're doing in Quebec and continue to strive to try and strengthen our really important community. So on the diminished sense of belonging, what I propose is that we try and increase and diversify our participation. What I mean by that is not only do we have to be involved the way we are, for example, in education in Quebec. If you listen to the news, we're often in the news being represented in terms of our school boards, our colleges, and our universities, and that's the focus of my presentation as well, which is really, really important. But what I'm suggesting here is we need to be involved in other areas as well. For example, healthcare, social services, arts and culture, sports, because the more we get involved in other areas, the more we diversify and increase our participation, the more roots we build in Quebec. So in that sense, kind of like using the analogy of a tree, the more entrenched we become, the more solid we grow, on our land, to continue that analogy, the more difficult it becomes to sway the tree or the community, of course, the more chances we have to decrease our willingness or our need to migrate outside of Quebec, right? So if we increase, again, and diversify our participation, we increase our ability to stay here in Quebec. I also think it's important to try and mitigate some of the structural limitations by increasing our participation around certain tables, government agencies, government departments. We need to get more involved. We need to find ways to be around decision-making tables, so when conversations do come up about government policies or programs, we can raise our hand and say, hey, the English-speaking community has to be considered as well. That's really important. In terms of lower income levels, as I mentioned, the Anglophone community has been shown to focus more on university, and that's, as I said, a great thing. However, like any coin, there's two sides. And the flip side of that is we sometimes underestimate the importance of alternative paths, for example, like the path of going into vocational education. And if we look at the studies, we know that trades pay really well in Quebec. There are actually a lot of job opportunities in various trades, whether it's becoming a plumber, for example, electrician, computing support technician, and many, many others. So if we focused on trades as a positive alternative to university education, it would go a long way in helping us increase our income levels and also access the job market in shorter periods of time, because some of the vocational programs are a year and a half, compared to, say, 3-4 years at the university level. It's important for me to mention here, knowing full well that the school boards are doing a fantastic job when it comes to vocational education and recruiting and retaining students within vocational education. But as I said earlier, this doesn't mean we're not doing the important work, but it does mean that we have to continue to focus our efforts because it's worthwhile to try and protect our community, obviously. I do mention that it's important to focus on French language training as well. Okay, so not only are we training individuals to go into the job market and obtain these trades, but we want to make sure that the students going through, the youth sector, adult sector, college and university have a strong base in French, because we know that French is the official language of Quebec, and their ability to speak French will have a direct impact on their ability to obtain employment and meaningful employment by increasing their income levels. In terms of the brain drain phenomenon, I think it's important for community-led initiatives and government-based initiatives to focus specifically on how can we help the English community stay in Quebec. And here I'm thinking about things like an action plan, for example, that would specifically look at how can we build in positive incentives to have people stay in Quebec. I'll use an example. We have incentives to buy electric cars, and we see that they work, right? They're financial incentives. Maybe can we as a group think about some incentives that would have people stay in Quebec as opposed to leave? I'd rather here focus on the positive, incentive-based with rewards versus the negative. I don't think that it's a good idea to get punitive in terms of our policies, but maybe we can put in positive policies that would encourage the English-speaking individuals of Quebec to stay here in Quebec. the last point I want to make here is obviously if we improve our sense of belonging, as per point one, and we improve our income levels, as per point two, it has a direct impact on our ability to stop the brain drain, as per point three. So they're all related. And again, these are just some ideas I wanted to float your way. Hopefully you can take some of these ideas and continue the conversation, whether it's within your classrooms or outside in the larger society. There is good news, all of this being said. If we look at, for example, the resources that have been put into protecting minority language rights in Quebec over the span of many years, we can see that they're quite high. For example, if we look at the periods from 2003 to 2008, $1.9 billion were invested. If we look at the periods from 2008 to 2013, $2.2 billion were invested. Another $2.2 billion over the period from 2013 to 2018. And finally, we're in the period between 2018 and 2023 right now, where the government has committed to invest an additional $2.7 billion. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it's not enough to just throw money at the problem. And you're right. But for those of you that understand the public sector and have had a chance to work within the public sector, you know that resources are often a limitation to being able to implement some of the ideas that I presented to you earlier. So definitely it's great news to know the resources are there. It's not enough in and of itself, but it's a really good start. Now, we also have a say, because it's one thing to have an action plan, but who was around the table influencing that action plan? And I can tell you that 350 people, many observers, there were 22 round tables held in various regions. Nearly 6,375 people voiced their perceptions and comments through a digital online interface. And over 100 briefs and letters were sent to the federal government during the consultation period that led to this, the action plan, which I made reference to earlier in the table, where an additional $2.8 billion is being invested. That action plan is entitled Investing in Our Future, 2018-2023 Action Plan for Official Languages. It's the government's commitment to investing in our future by strengthening our communities. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Strengthening access to services, which is key for many communities, especially minority ones. Can you access, for example, healthcare in English? Can you access educational services in English? And also promoting a bilingual Canada. So that sort of sums up my presentation. I hope that I've given you avenues to further think about and explore. And the idea here is to encourage you to pursue the important conversation around community, the importance of community, and how can we safeguard it. I'd like to conclude by obviously saying thank you and also leaving you with a quote I really like. Alone we go faster, together we go further. Let's stay together as a community. Let's pursue this important dialogue and conversation, and I'm confident that we can continue to safeguard the really important English language community in Quebec the way we've done for the several past years. Thank you so much. Good luck with your studies, and importantly, stay safe. All the best.
All right. Thank you, Charbel. Wow, there's a lot of statistically rich and great analysis and some interesting figures that one might not expect to necessarily hear when we're talking about these things, right? So folks, here's, I'm sure there's got to be some questions on people's minds about some of the content that Charbel brought to us or presented. So now's the time. I'm waiting for your questions on the Q&A board, right? So you have a Q&A feature in your Zoom. You just type out your questions. So as soon as questions come in, I will verbally ask them, to Charbel, and Charbel will answer them for us. So it's always kind of tough to get to break the ice But once the first question usually comes in, then I think people tend to lose their shyness, and we get a series of questions coming in. So I need somebody, a brave person out of the attendees, to actually, give me the first question. This would have been a great advantage of having you folks here in the auditorium, because I would have picked a volunteer, if nobody asks a question, just like I do in classes sometimes, right? But unfortunately, I don't have that luxury right now. So please get us the questions, and we'll get Charbel to give us some more interesting answers to the questions, right? Well, here's a first one, Charb. So how do Indigenous first language speakers or other first language populations, such as the Jewish community, fall into this conversation?
Thank you. You do hear me, correct, Ara?
Yes, we do.
All right, so let me just begin by saying thank you to the students and Vanier College, Ara as well, Bruce and Sydney, for setting this all up. Ara, when you reached out, I too thought it would be a treat for me to be able to spend some time with you on Zoom. So thank you again. Regarding the question, that's a great question. Actually, different groups fall into different, it depends what sector we're looking at. I'll give you a specific example. In education, for example, I work with the 9 English school boards, but oftentimes for a lot of our projects, the Cree and Kativik school board are also included in our projects. And that's important because some of the figures that I presented today regarding the federal amounts being given to the provinces through Heritage Canada go into something called the Canada-Quebec Entente, which is essentially project monies that are meant to support, the English communities. And there, I guess the question is, who do we include in the English community? And like I'm saying, with some educational projects, oftentimes it is also the Cree and Kativik communities as well. So we get to brainstorm some ideas that we think are going to be beneficial to those communities, and we can put in place some projects that go a long way to protecting them. So I hope I'm answering part of the question, which is it depends on the project, but certainly I know at the Ministry of Education level, the Cree and Kativik communities are considered part of the English speaking communities. And so are the Jewish communities as well. Whether we're talking about private schools, I did mention 23 private schools that are English speaking. Obviously, some of them are Jewish schools as well. So I hope that answers the question, and feel free to follow up if not.
Okay, we have another question. So have Anglo demographics from the point of view of the school boards been moving from one region to another? Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay. I was just saying, also a great question. First of all, it's important to say that the numbers have gone down quite a lot, actually, for the English school boards. So right now we're hovering at around 100,000 students in the 9 English school boards, which is actually quite low comparatively speaking. We're talking about over 1 million students in the French boards. Obviously there's more French school boards, but in terms of total numbers, we're looking at over 1 million students in the youth sector, Francophone, and about 100,000, maybe a little bit less now in the English sector. So overall numbers have gone down, but based on the chart that I provided, they do look different from one region to another. So on the island of Montreal, numbers are steadily strong. In the South Shore as well, all of the Montérégie regions, they're high as well. And in Laval, we're seeing perhaps exceptionally a small uptick in numbers to answer the question in Laval. So some of it has to do with, as I said, some of the new communities moving into Laval that are English speaking. And so our numbers do go up a little bit in that region.
Next question, right? Do you have an example of a project that you think could serve as a model for other projects?
Well, thank you for the question, because it gives me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that I'm doing. Yes, there are at the school board level, there are programs called in French les AEP, or in English STCs, which are skills training certificates. They're short in terms of duration, short programs that are designed to meet a need in the workforce. So I'll give you an example. There's a program called hairdressing, which doesn't include men's haircuts. And so there's a new program called Becoming a Barber. And that program is developed in French, but it hasn't been translated in English yet. And one of the things that I do is I constantly, raise my hand and tell certain organizations like, for example, la Fédération des Centres de Services Scolaires du Québec, which is an organization that represents the French service centers, because they're called service centers now and no longer school boards. So I get to be around the table and say, don't forget about the English language community. And through some of the ECQ funds, which are the Entente Canada-Quebec funds, we're able to translate some of those important programs that we can then give back to the school board so they can go into the communities and give some of the English language speakers some new opportunities to access the job market in shorter time periods. So that's an example of a project, and there are many, many other examples of similar projects.
Thank you, Charb. So, here's a little bit more of a challenging one, a little bit more sensitive, but we are in an educational setting and institution, right? So we need to talk about these things, if not here, where else, right? Do you think there is a factor of racism displayed in how the government or French-speaking people interact with the English community in terms of funding, rights, or just normal day-to-day life?
Yeah, that is a more sensitive question. I think the way I would probably approach that question is, I think if in terms of how the French interact with the English, I mean, it would be nearly impossible to make a blanket type statement and say, yes, they're treating us, I'm going to go ahead and include myself, obviously, in the English community, in a racist way. But perhaps more importantly is looking at things that are structural or institutional, So if we look at certain structural realities or policies even, like, for example, the Charter of the French language, I mean, it's fair to say that it's a policy that has had a negative impact on the English community in Quebec in terms of driving down the numbers of English-speaking students, for example, in our schools. And I'm not sure you know this, but that charter applies to all students up until the age of 16. After 16 years of age, you have the choice to study in English or French. And that's why, in my case, when I graduated from high school, I decided to go to Vanier, because what's otherwise known as Bill 101 is not applicable to college yet. And hopefully that doesn't change, But certainly someone could look at that policy and say, it's kind of an institutional, discriminatory practice. I mean, someone could make that argument. I think it's plausible to make the argument. But for me, what's important is to look at the full picture, to say, well, wait a minute. Why does that policy exist? I'm referring to the Canadian Charter of French Language. And, we have to be able to paint a fair portrait in the sense of saying, well, it's there because it's meant to protect the French language. And that I can understand the importance of doing that. And certainly there's value in doing that. So I kind of also see it from that angle. But I would conclude by saying the following. I think that if we want to strike a healthy balance, then we look at the charter and we understand the fact that it's meant to protect the French language. But for Anglophones, we have to look at other ways to get involved in the community in order to continue to keep it vibrant, not only through education, not only by insisting we have English school boards, but getting involved in other avenues, because we know that the English language around the world is obviously very strong. So we have that going for us. If we can continue to get involved economically, but in other sectors as well, like healthcare, for example, cultural and arts, we may go a long way in mitigating what could be seen, as I said, as a discriminatory, institutional practice here in Quebec. And I hope that answers the question. Obviously, I'm keeping it as positive as possible, because I think in the end we benefit more by doing that.
Thank you, Charb. Very interesting answer. Next question. How do we preserve English schools and school boards when most children of immigrants are sent to the French systems?
That's really tough. And I mean, the short answer is I'm not sure. But I think at one point we need to say, okay, if in fact we know that the Canadian Charter of French Language the Charter of the French Language is in place, which we do know it is, chances are that's not going away anytime soon. So what I would propose is maybe we should look at potentially changing our objective here. So is our objective to absolutely have English language-based school boards, or is our objective to ensure that our community remains vibrant? And the reason why I say that is because, a couple months ago, the French school boards were abolished, and they're now called les centres de services scolaires. And they looked at doing the same thing for the English language school boards, but because of Article 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we were able to push back that decision, and it's now been put on hold. So that's a win. But if we look at the numbers and we see that they've gone down to 100,000, and I suspect that if the trend continues, they'll continue to go down a little bit more, the question becomes, what else might we do to try to ensure the community is vibrant? We have to look at other more creative ways to ensure that it remains strong in Quebec.
Okay, next question. Do you believe the government has done enough to include different language speakers beside Francophones? And if not, how can we improve on this?
So I'm not, just a clarification, include them
in where? That's a good question, right? We'll ask the speaker to actually, the attendee to actually make a precision. So I have on my screen here, it's Joyce that actually asked that question, right? So Joyce, if you could just specify, in that question, do you believe the government has done enough to include different language speakers besides Francophone? Include them where? Include them how? Maybe be a little bit more specific. As you're typing out, what you mean, or defining your question a little bit, we'll go to the next question and we'll come back to yours. All right. So the next question, Charbel, is how will the English speaking community do if a separatist government comes into place?
Well, and Ara, you could speak to this a lot as well. I mean, the reality is that we never know, right? I mean, if we take a political party's platform, we may make some assumptions. We may say, oh, well, it's going to be very bad for the English community. But actually, depending on the policy or the situation or the macro context that the political party finds itself, we may be surprised by the outcomes. So, I don't know. Certainly what seems to be on the front burner and oftentimes in the news is this desire to, extend Bill 101 beyond age 16 into the colleges. And I think for me, that would be a big concern I would have. Again, if I was anticipating what a separatist party would do if they were to come into power, that would be one of the anticipations I would have. And I think it would be detrimental not only to the English community, but to the community of Quebec as well. Because the reality is that if we look at a college like Vanier or Dawson or any of the English public CEGEPs, a high percentage, and I believe the last I checked, it was at around 30% of the students are actually Francophone students. So essentially, what would be happening is that you'd have a government putting in place a policy that, yes, is punitive to the English community, but also punitive to the community at large in Quebec, because we'd be taking away Francophones' ability or desire to also study in English once out of high school. So I'm not sure that that kind of policy would find a lot of popularity in society, in the community. So, but that is something I would be worrying about.
Thanks, Sharb. And you know what, just from an anecdotal perspective or point of view, I can confirm to you that at least in my feeling is I see more and more primary French speakers, in my classrooms and in the halls at Vanier, which I find is, refreshing and a wonderful thing. The opposite would also be, refreshing and wonderful, possibly to find, primarily Anglophone speakers in the French language CEGEPs as well, right? So for the moment, Joyce hasn't gotten back to us, with more specificity. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So she writes, I apologize for the confusion. Include them in the sense of community, right? So if we just go back to the original question, do you believe the government has done enough to include different language speakers besides Francophones? And if not, how we can improve on this? And the specificity says, include them in the sense of community. In particular, has the government done enough to make it simpler for different language speakers to get jobs and have more opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually I would defer back to, and I guess whenever you have the chance to do this, it's probably a smart idea. I defer back to Barack Obama in terms of what he said when he said, government is important, but it's not enough, right? He says that if we play back, and I know we're not going to do that right now, but if we play back the Loom video, that's what he says, and what he means there is, we could have policies in place. And to answer the question, I would say, no, I don't think it's done enough. But I don't know that it will ever be enough. I think that speaks to the importance of community and how our communities have to help us, those within those respective communities, access services. And that's really important. So I do think there's work being done. When we look at Canadian heritage, one of the 3 pillars of their action plan is to strengthen, access to services. So I know that's a preoccupation, and I know that funds are made available, but the way in which we go about accessing those services, I think is a role that's probably best played for now by the community itself and not so much the government. But no, I don't think they're doing enough, and there's room for improvement, that's for sure.
That's great. Okay, thanks, Charbel. So we have a couple of minutes left, no more questions. So I could give you, time for a concluding remark or observation if you want to take that opportunity. If not, I'll, make my closing remarks for this session. Sure.
Well, I just wanted, again, to thank you, Era, for the invite. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to, come back, even though not physically, to the Vanier community. I thank all the students. I think we all play a really important role in society and in our respective communities. And if I was able to, just generate some curiosity or, food for thought, as they say, then my job would be done here, as they say. So thank you again for the opportunity, Era, Bruce and Sydney for supporting also, obviously. And I just wish everybody, safety and good health.
All right. Thank you very much, Charbel. There's actually a student who just posted something that said, I don't really have a question, but I found this very interesting. Thank you. Right. So good stuff. Right. So My turn to thank you, Sharp, for accepting the invitation and for giving us this very informative and analytical presentation about the state of the English community and challenges or issues or even positives, right? I think it speaks to the heart of the theme of the festival this year in terms of community, obviously, direct bearing. So thanks again. And this concludes Charbel's talk, and hopefully I'll see more of you, the attendees, tomorrow. We have 2 more sessions left before we wrap up the festival. All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.